welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, after world leaders met in Glasgow to mitigate the climate crisis, what exactly did they discuss? What was in the agreement? And what does that mean for the future of the planet? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. Earlier this month, the nations of the world sent representatives to Glasgow, Scotland, to negotiate on climate change in what was the 26th COP or COP meetings. The climate crisis has intensified since the previous COP meetings, and these meetings drew a particular attention of the entire global media, as well as a vast network of activist groups. Did the meeting meet the needs of the globe in addressing this crisis? Was it largely successful? On today's show, we will break down the negotiations. Our panel today is Shannon Gibson, Associate Professor of Political Science, International Relations, and Environmental Studies at the University of Southern California. She's the author of Environmental Praxis, Climate Activism, and the UNFCCC, a Participatory Action Research Approach. Klaus Weber, Professor of Management and Organizations and Deputy Director of the Northwestern University Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. He's also affiliated with the Institute for Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern University. He's the author of Organizational Structure from Interaction, Evidence from Corporate Sustainability Efforts. And Reynaldo Morales, Assistant Professor at Northwestern University with a joint faculty appointment at the Medill School of Journalism and Media and the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. He is the author of Building Global Indigenous Media Networks, Envisioning Sustainable and Regenerative Futures Around Indigenous Peoples' Meaningful Representation. Thank you all for joining us today. Shannon Gibson, I'll start with you. Can you give us a bit of a description of the synopsis of the agreements that were negotiated at the COP meeting?
First, it helps to provide a little bit of context about what COP26 was about. So we were gathering basically for the 5-year anniversary. And if you could see me, I would be holding up air quotes because, again, really it's 5+1 because of the COVID pandemic. But basically, the idea was to come together these 5 years after signing the Paris Agreement back in 2015. And there were a couple of sort of things that were being focused on. The first was to kind of re-up the commitments, right? There's this aspect of the Paris Agreement where countries are supposed to ratchet up their commitments every 5 years. So that was something that we were looking for countries to come in and do. But the other thing to point out is that we weren't writing necessarily a new climate treaty. What we're continuing to do these 6 years later is still implement the Paris Agreement. So there were a lot of things that were accomplished at COP26, looking at mitigation, finance, the rules for carbon trading, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, right? So there are lots of little pieces together that build up to make the Glasgow Pact. But I can say just a little bit, at least on the mitigation part, because that seems to be what the media was focusing on, especially the first couple of days where you have all the prime ministers and presidents coming in and making their grand speeches. Because that is one thing about these COPs is that they have become very much a stage for countries to come in and make these big pronouncements. So going in to COP26, it was looking like all of the previous Paris pledges were going to take us to about a 2.7 degree world. And again, context, we're shooting for 1.5, according to the Paris Agreement. Throughout the weeks, when you look at the new targets and pledges that came in, it dropped us about to a 2.4. And again, there's some margin of error and give and take here. I'm using the Climate Action Tracker as some of my reference points. And then by the end, when you look at pledges and targets, including the new US-China announcement, that takes us to about a 2.1. So on that mitigation front, the kind of ramping up our commitment to climate mitigation, there was some small, slow progress, but we're still missing the initial marks that were laid out by the Paris Agreement.
And Klaus Weber, were there any specific areas we saw some significant improvements, perhaps even beyond what the initial expectations for what was going to be accomplished at these meetings?
I largely concur with Shannon that there's two elements to it. One is the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and I think we saw some pretty good progress there, especially in the areas of when you look at the creation of global carbon markets. One concern is obviously that you do double counting, you don't have real mechanisms for verifying that things happen on the ground. And I think that there was some pretty good progress that I sort of expected, to be honest, because 5 years after Paris, it was about time to tie some of those things down. And so this is sort of the more technical institution building aspects that is really bringing the Paris Agreement to life. I think expected, but it sort of delivered to the extent it could. There's always sort of trade-offs. I think there was some welcome surprises. The US-China announcement is one of them, because as probably everyone knows, the relationship between the US and China in pretty much all other policy areas is pretty frosty. And so having an announcement that is, at least in its ambitions, quite strong was very positive. I think the language that was inserted around the phase out of non-abated coal is something that is positive, even though it was really watered down in the end at the last minutes to make it happen. But just having it in there, I think, is substantial. And I think there were some announcements on the sides. As Shannon said, the COP meetings have become an event not just about the UN negotiations, but for a lot of other climate action. And one item that I would want to point out from a private sector perspective was the announcement of the attempt to create global standardized reporting standards for corporations on climate change. And that will be under the umbrella of the International Accounting Standards Board, which is the same board that looks at regular accounting standards. And what that means is that we actually have a way to make corporate sector entities, large corporations, small ones, accountable in a much more effective way, which I think is fundamental to making the carbon markets that the Paris Treaty emphasized actually work in practice. I think there were a few sort of positive announcements in terms of commitments and in terms of technicalities. There were obviously some that were missing, but I think we can talk about those in due course.
Reynaldo Morales, was there anything that you found that was particularly striking as far as what the meetings actually accomplished?
Well, I work with a specific constituent group, and a strategic constituent group of the civil society, which is indigenous peoples. The group that I am part of, since also in parallel with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and also a group that works on sustainable development at the high-level political forum. All these different consistent groups form a representation that is unique and very distinctive from other constituent groups. In the case of indigenous peoples, the conference created as an imposition for many a platform that is called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. However, within that group, we're talking about major differences. In the case of indigenous peoples, we're talking about approximately 476 million of people living across 90 countries. But there is another hundreds of millions of people who are not recognized as such. There is an issue of not well informed the collective rights of indigenous peoples and international law and policy. We have also the issues of the economic value of their knowledge systems in terms of genetic resources, in terms of many different aspects of sustainable development and the rights to consent. So much less with the recognition of the value of traditional knowledge, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, that we're talking about possible surplus for indigenous peoples of $5.4 billion that will really resolve many of the issues that are being discussed through the climate change conference and other conferences, when this specific, not stakeholder, but the right holder group and population, world population, enters into the negotiations. So some of the most important issues for this group are to be recognized as right holders, not as stakeholders, for example, as corporations or even NGOs or organizations from civil society, that they shouldn't be confounded or mixed with local communities. This group of different institutions that are gathered around different themes and different identities. You can find lots of non-indigenous organizations, religious organizations, gender-based, peasant, farmers, NGOs, different forms of cooperatives, etc. So the platform had to make a distinction and took a stance saying we're going to concern only on the rights of indigenous peoples because those are the ones who manage territory, significant territory, which huge impact on climate change and biodiversity, which are like cause and effect to each other. And we were focused on the territorial rights, human, political, social, cultural, environmental rights of this specific distinctive group of people with governance systems, legal background, etc. So that's the arena in which the participation of indigenous peoples had the climate change conference. We had our own pavilion. We had actually a facilitative working group that was in session prior to the starting of the conference. So the recognition of their presence and meaningful participation, I think it was a very interesting development in this conference.
Now, Reynaldo, I'd like to follow up on this. So the groups that you've worked with here, I guess there's two different ways you could potentially interpret this. One is that indigenous peoples are unique compared to other elements of civil society because, as you said, the control, the way in which the relationship they've had with the control of territory and the management of resources, which it seems like, at least at one level, it's asserting a degree of sovereignty, or maybe even in some cases equal sovereignty or co-sovereignty with some of the states. Because I know one of the critiques of the whole COP process is it's very much based on the sovereignty paradigm. And so I guess one of the questions is, are the indigenous populations asserting sovereignty, or are they seeking to change kind of some of this foundational structure that's really focused on state sovereignty with much more of a recognition that maybe there's different ways we should look at these questions?
We'll have to actually understand the distinction between different frameworks or political identities. In terms of sovereignty, it only has been granted to indigenous peoples in the global north that were under the British colonial history and political formation of nation states. We're talking about United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There are some Pacific Islanders communities that are, for example, the nation of Hawaii, and you have also Chamorros and indigenous peoples in Guam and Virgin Islands. Their governance systems are not fully recognized. The nation of Hawaii self-identified themselves as such. But in the rest of the world, you mean, when you talk about Portuguese and Spaniard colonization, those monarchies didn't sign any treaties, because the treaties that the British monarchy signed with indigenous peoples in these countries was at the level of nations. So sovereignty recognized, the nation state recognized as a sub-nation, right, as a dependent nation, and when all nations are ratified themselves under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the International Labour Organization, Article 169, and there are many other provisions. They basically renounce to any possible succession, and they actually affirm that they are part of a nation state and abide to their laws. Of course, there are treaties that they sign with the colonial power. Those constitute major legal instruments and provisions. So these are very complex and solid legal history between the indigenous peoples and certain countries which when they sign treaties. In the other case of the world, we're talking about largely on the third world countries called, or the global south, the identities, the political identities behind the indigenous peoples is completely complex. Many of them have not been constitutionally recognized. Therefore, and they created organizations, institutions, cooperatives, and even became completely demoted into commercial structures like agrarian cooperatives. So you see that the politics of recognition play a huge role in this relationship. But nonetheless, there is an international law and a large representation in many different UN instances related to the rights of indigenous peoples.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing the recent COP26 meetings in Glasgow, Scotland, with Shannon Gibson of the University of Southern California, Klaus Weber of Northwestern University, and Reynaldo Morales of Northwestern University. Shannon Gibson, following on this theme of civil society, the impact of civil society, I know there were huge concerns sort of pandemic-centric related concerns about different formats that might cut civil society out of these negotiations. Were civil society representatives pretty present at Glasgow? And what kind of impact did they have? Or was this largely kind of a state-to-state sort of negotiation?
I would say that COP26, from my perspective, being situated within the climate justice movement, the North American climate justice movement within civil society, is that COP26 was probably the most exclusive, privileged COP that we've ever seen. That there was far less representation from particular groups from the global south, from communities with less resources, for people who are not able to get COVID vaccines or tests, or to even be able to afford the astronomical prices for hotels and flights for getting in and out of Glasgow. So there were a number of barriers, some related to COVID, others, as someone who has been to 4 COPs in person, over the years, we've seen that security has been used quite often as a reason to significantly restrict access to civil society, both when they're doing the high level ministerial, right? Because, you've got the Bidens and the different high level political figures that are there. But then even at the end, they start doing the same thing. So I think while the UN, say compared to, the World Bank or the IMF or the Security Council, does offer more access for civil society compared to other institutions, there has been a consistent downward trend in terms of real meaningful access. And I think that kind of started back in 2009. So yes, lots of barriers this time around.
And sort of same question, but different community for you, Klaus Weber. I know you do a lot of work on corporations, and there was a lot of the focus on corporate initiatives. In fact, some of the reviews I've read from COP26 was that there seems to be a lot of faith in some of these different corporate campaigns. How present were corporations at COP26, and how much faith should we have in some of these campaigns?
I'd want to build on Shannon's comment that in a way, COP26 was paradox because there were quite a large number of observer organizations and delegates present, but the access to the actual negotiations and to actually influence was severely restricted. And part of that, I understand, is COVID related. Part of it, I think, is probably a conscious choice on part of the people that drive the process to keep some constituencies out, to be honest. What it resulted in is that some constituents organizations, and from a UN perspective, that includes corporations, indigenous peoples, youth organization activists, civil society, everyone. Some of them that are well connected to the people that do the actual negotiations, so the state government level actors, obviously still exert influence. And others who do not have those institutionalized channels that are not related to the COP summit, but that are just based on their country level access to politicians, do have impact. And I think you see that if you compare the influence of corporations, the private sector, I don't think it was diminished at all. If anything, it was stronger, but it didn't necessarily work through what you see on the floor during the summit. This happened sort of behind closed doors or in informal consultations that go well earlier than the actual negotiations that happened at the COP summits. And so I think the corporations had a large influence on both the agenda and on the outcomes. And you see that primarily in a heavy reliance on market-based solutions, which the corporate sector favors, on an emphasis on some of the technical details that allow corporations to make investments and get returns. A lot of that was actually served by the agreements that we saw in the end. Finance becoming very prominent and a heavy emphasis on private finance, filling in the substantial gaps left by public finance promises that weren't kept. And so I think the corporate sector was actually quite well represented, but it's not because of the access to the actual event. It's because they already have very close relationships with the politicians and the diplomats that do the negotiations. The parties that lost out are the ones that don't have that. So, a lot of the youth activist groups, the indigenous peoples that were quite vocal and very visible, but I think Reynaldo would sort of confirm that, really struggled to get into making a real impact on the outcomes. And so I think you see that asymmetry between different stakeholder groups that is sort of a throwback to when all of this happened behind closed doors anyway. And I think the hope was that with the UN umbrella, it would become not just more transparent in terms of, oh, I can see what someone says on the floor, but more transparent in terms of influence and access to decision makers. And for that, I think, yes, the corporations did much better than most others because they didn't have to rely on the COP summit infrastructure to exert their influence.
A little disheartening in that the whole system was supposed to open up and engage much more civil society. And Paris promised even sub-state actors being able to sign on to the Paris Pledge and everything else. But what you're saying is if you want to do a study of which of these actors have the most influence, it will reflect whatever those actors have the influence within the governments themselves. So
don't get me wrong. I think that the corporate sector and the private sector is absolutely essential to tackle climate change, right? There's no way around it. Industry produces the emissions. They develop the technologies that can reduce them. But I think we see a sort of a narrowing of stakeholders to some of the ones that are already quite powerful and a marginalization of some of the others that need to have important voice in the process.
Sounds like sort of the core question of, is this a structure that's up to the challenge for climate change? This may be an area that you would suggest that there needs to be some alterations, some revisions, of the structure. And Reynaldo Morales, I'll ask you that question. Is it fair to say that because of at least this question of, who are the actors and the influence they have on states, that something that needs to happen in future COPs is just opening up this process even further?
Well, one of the kind of worms that nobody wants to open, right? This is a political discussion when lots of the political decisions are based on histories that many times nobody wants to revise, review, revisit. And in many cases, some others that constitute opportunities really to redefine the future, right? In many cases, what I see is that the recognition of the political history of how nation states have been created and the relationships that took place in order for them to be what they are and the impact of that history. We're talking about very recent history. The people don't think much on that because we're seeing, Chicago, the huge development. You cannot think about Chicago 200 years ago. But in the case of development, we're talking about just the impact of 300 years ago, primarily, and less than that, against societies that have lived for thousands of years for here, and that had an impact on their management, on natural resources and landscape for thousands of years. That part is not openly recognized. And so in most of the treaties and conventions, think from the time we ratified these forward, we don't see the background many times. So in the case of indigenous peoples, we had some issues that needed to be reaffirmed after the Madrid conference that needed to be resolved. So that's why we sustained our action on Article 6. The delegation had multiple different fronts. So there has been really an amazing qualitative improvement of the indigenous people's representation, not only having dedicated spaces, but also the mention of their rights and the ratification of the preambular paragraph 11 of the Paris Agreement in relationship to human rights and indigenous peoples and local communities and other constituents was affirmed this time. And it was actually in danger because there were some moves from countries that wanted to remove the minimum safeguards that indigenous peoples were trying to defend, not only the climate change conference. Those safeguards, and it was appalling to see that there were some countries that were really in favor of removing some minimum safeguards in complete disregard of the political history that we have, and only with certain rules. That's why in Article 6, we had to really work hard, and my work has been to work on a technical committee, actually on Article 6, and especially in Article 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. There were other groups working in outreach. There are other groups working at the executive level, meeting with parties and governments and international figures, there were like 4 or 5 different layers of participation. For us, we were 10 or 12 guys meeting in complete isolation, analyzing every language, every word of the Article 6, and going back to the national delegations and negotiating and consulting and drafting and discussing and getting back and reviewing decisions from years ago that we could sustain or justify our position. So it's a very, very strong and intense process. And so nothing is final. As you mentioned, if it's any hopes or we should be completely devastated by the outcomes, it didn't end on December 12th. There are people working on these COPs for 25, 30 years. There will be people after us that will continue this process of negotiation. What I see is that we reached a level of maturity in how seriously we are now seeing the impact of nation states development, how populations and technologies and industries in science influence many of the ways in which humanities live today. These impacts have to be considered in our position from the consideration of a rights-based approach, nature-based solutions, thinking on importance and emphasis on non-market solutions, on capacity building and a financial mechanisms that allow direct contribution to indigenous peoples and not governments or NGOs. So we see an influx of huge layer of intermediaries, and that creates a problem. So for us, there are many concerns, right? But we see it as a process. And we now have a viable way in which we establish a dialogue with countries. And now finally, we are heard and we are considered at a new level. So there is a historical shift that happened at this COP. I think many people in our delegation are satisfied in the way in which these negotiations and this ground of relationships are going.
And Shannon, you had a response to that as well.
I think in terms of thinking about your question, where you kind of posed it as, do we need to see this increased access for civil society? I also wanted to note another trend that I've seen, which has been the way in which states engage in the access for individual countries, right? Because I think it was quite strategic in terms of having the G20 right before COP26. And I can't tell you how many times I heard John Kerry, the US representative, say over and over, 20 countries count for 80% of emissions. He said it in almost every public speech he gave. And I think we're seeing another trend where the decision making around mitigation, adaptation, finance, all these different Paris Agreement elements is becoming more exclusive within the state arena as well, that there's a big question about how much we're getting done through the COP process, both by individual governments and civil society. And so I would not be surprised to see maybe in the next decade or two that many of these decisions might be moving to the G20, the G8, happening more along lines bilateral deals like the US and China. So I think that there's, this issue of access and who has a seat at the table doesn't just apply to civil society. That applies to representation from, the G77, the rainforested nations, all the different coalitions that exist, because not every government is getting a seat at the table too. And, in these final days when we're all haggling over which word will be included or changed in these final agreements.
Shannon, I'm going to return back to you and see if we can get into some of the details of some of these agreements. I know there was an agreement announced on deforestation at the COP meetings. What exactly was this agreement, and how does it relate to sort of previous agreements on deforestation?
So I actually this week had my class, the class that I teach on the politics of the global environment, look at this much heralded and sort of, very much praised agreement on deforestation, and they gave it a C- in their assessment. So when we look at deforestation or the forest regime in general, it's one of our weakest regimes when it comes to kind of looking at how we protect natural resources. We have a lot of soft law, loosely binding agreements. Some of the stronger elements happen to be taken up either in the Convention on Biological Diversity or in climate change, because that's where we're including forests as offsets and potential, market mechanisms and credits to be bought and sold. So the crux, the big part, and the agreement's not very long, it's only like a page and a half. The big thing is that, this 100 plus countries agreed to phase out deforestation by 2030. But again, it's all we agree to work on. We promise to attempt to reach this goal. There's no details really of how that will be achieved. Will this halt in deforestation be based on carbon, is it going to be based on offsets, where countries are offsetting their deforestation in developing countries? Is it going to be based off of massive afforestation efforts, which again, details here. Are we going to be reforesting with local, naturally diverse forests, or are we going to be doing monocrops, tree plantations? So, on the surface, it's good to have countries talking about deforestation and picking sort of timelines to phase these things out. But the details of how you get there are incredibly important. And I would say that this agreement doesn't really get into that granularity that a lot of us would have hoped that it could have.
And Klaus Weber, I know sort of on this agreement, on so many other agreements, one of the great criticisms of the agreements at COP was it opens the door to allow for countries, for corporations, et cetera, to figure out what to take credit for something they've already been doing, as opposed to increasing, to increasing that commitment. On this or any of the other agreements, how fair is that as a criticism of the agreements coming out of COP?
I mean, I think it's generally a fair criticism, and to some extent, it simply reflects the immaturity of the underlying institutional space in which this happens. So, there isn't there aren't very good verification systems. Most of it is self-reported. There's little real sort of tooth behind some of those commitments in terms of independent verification. The governance is sort of vague. And so I think that there is, as always, a lot of scope for double counting bad solutions that actually get credits. And I would almost take any of the commitments when you calculate them out. I would apply a pretty substantial discount in terms of the actual impact on the global carbon balance, because there's going to be a lot of just friction, imperfections, and deliberate malfeasance, right? So I think it's a fair criticism, and some of the negotiations focused on what should be baselines to establish additionality, because we don't want to just, basically give credit for leaving something that would have happened anyway, or, I guess palm trees are also trees, right? So is that forestation or is that the opposite? And so there's a lot of very detailed issues, and I think the language got tightened a little bit. It still leaves a substantial amount of loopholes because the verification systems aren't in place to actually make sure that what people claim they do is actually happening, and we can't oftentimes very directly measure. I mean, there's some technological solutions. You can look at some satellite-based geoimagery and see how much of the forest actually there. What you can't tell if whether that is the native biodiverse forest that you actually want, or whether it's non-native species that basically provide cover, but otherwise are not terribly sensible. So there's imperfections. The way I prefer to look at it is the alternative oftentimes is to have nothing. And so I think we live in the era of announcements and commitments that are vague. And you can see that as the blah blah that the activists sort of say. It's just empty words. You can also see it as a step forward because those commitments weren't made 10, 15 years ago because the political climate wasn't really making governments do that. What it also means is that the commitments themselves are not enough. We need the continuous work that Reynaldo referred to. This is going to go on for years and years, and we need continued pressure from civil society groups to actually make those things credible. We need continued political commitment to work on the implementation to actually make it work. And I think the negative example that a lot of people have in the back of their mind is the first attempt to have a global carbon trading mechanism with the clean development mechanism that the UN implemented, which I think is probably universally seen as somewhere between a clear and massive failure, right? And I think the reason was because there wasn't that follow-on. There wasn't the technical and institutional work to actually make it happen. And if all the participants in a process have learned that lesson and follow up those commitments with actual implementation measures, I think we're in a much better shape. And then the commitments are positive. We don't know yet, and we'll have to see over the next years how it actually plays out.
And Shannon, to kind of follow up, one of the interesting things Klaus said, and I know that was one of the critiques, I think, of Greta Thunberg in particular, criticizing the blah, blah going on, this is just words. But some words that I think are particularly salient here were the words on coal, that there was a call for a phase out of coal, and those words were actually altered to a phase down. To the observer that may not be, as familiar with the language, phase down sounds pretty good, but that was a significant change, wasn't it?
Yeah, so this is some language that me and my team were following quite closely, and I was attending from remote using the COP26 platform because I didn't travel to Glasgow. So we were, up in the middle of the night waiting for these draft texts to come out. And so you have on, November 10th, that this language starts out with calls upon parties to accelerate the phase out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels. Right. And so this is the first time, well, it's been said in the media that's the first time we've ever had, coal and fossil fuels in a treaty. And that's partially true. These words have appeared in draft text in earlier years. They never make it to the end. So this is the first time they made it to the end. But in the short course of about 72 hours, that small statement changed quite a bit. So you're correct. We have this shift from phase out to phase down. Some reports indicate that China and India may have had a hand in that language, though I suspect they're not the only ones, and they weren't the only ones that were quietly supportive of that change. Two other things happened with that language. First, by the end, we put the term unabated in front of coal. And so you might think unabated coal, what does that mean? What it does is it opens up the possibility for a lot of carbon capture and storage options, which a lot of people, for scientific, environmental, justice reasons, thinking about long-term strategies, are quite concerned about carbon capture and storage technology. And then the second thing is that it then shifts, and now you put in inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And so then that opens up, again, Pandora's box. What does inefficient fossil fuel subsidies mean? Who's to determine what is efficient and what is inefficient? So in the short course of just 3 days, we watched this statement, by just the simple shifting of a word and the addition of two words, change dramatically in its intent and then overall impact.
And Reynaldo Morales, sort of other instances that you'd like to cite about how the language itself throughout the conference had altered in ways that seem to be not terribly important, but actually are, really quite significant in any of the agreements.
Maybe not on the words itself, but they're in their omissions, right, in many cases, right? In the case of governance, or in the case of, deforestation, we have to differentiate between what are just pledges or aspirations, right? Ambitions from governments, to actual statements, what are put into consideration, to actual resolutions and recommendations that are technical and have to be followed up and enter into a process. In the case of deforestation, for example, I think this is a very high ambition pledge that requires specific implementation. And for me, the key of the whole thing, which is a huge omission of the COP, and I think it's intentional because it falls into the fragments of the political history of all countries, is the word governance. Because many of the constituents who work with nation states or should share their solutions and work together have different levels of different natures and different forms of governance. And especially in the case of forests, I would ask who manage the forests? Who are the peoples, the technical entities, the bodies who manage forests across the world? And those are indigenous peoples, really. And even in the cases where there are national forests that are in protected areas, where are just national parks, either indigenous, those landscapes and those territories were indigenous territories before, and they became national parks because of the level of management that they had. None of them were wilderness or unoccupied or savage land, nothing like that. Everything was carefully managed by millennia. So the governance of different counterparts is a key issue. And in implementation, it will matter, because if those indigenous peoples, in the case of the peoples that I work and I represented, are Peruvian Amazonian peoples, Council of Tribes, the tribe that I represented manages 3 million hectares of protected forests. And the other 4 or 5 representatives for other Amazonian nations that I work with, and we are in this block, manage in total something like 50 or 60 in total, millions of hectares of forest. And they don't have the recognition of the Peruvian government as nation, as a governance system. They have the aspiration of council, etc., but they couldn't yet be recognized as a form of government with autonomy, not sovereignty, with autonomy. And self-determination is a principle that the United Nations Permanent Forum or the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also enacts as a major principle. None of them have recognized governance status. The immediate question will be, at the stage of implementation, who's gonna irrogate themselves the authority to take care of those resources? In the case of forests, for example, when the forest has already a nation or a council of traditional communities that have been in charge of that for ancestral times, how the government will work with those specific communities in order to preserve those forests. In the case of India, we have a background of something that happened in India years ago, when a couple of years ago, I think, when there was the order to evict, right, a national forest. 1.5 million of people were ordered to evict because in that case, that forest was declared a conservation area, the territories of conservation. So if that will become like a top-down order, that on behalf of deforestation, indigenous peoples will be displaced, their rights and their governance status would be denied or demoted, or make it subject to intermediation for financial mechanisms that do not recognize the rights evenly. That's a challenge that we have. So there will be millions of dollars and the pledges of really a significant amount of money. How the actual protectors of certain resources, genetic resources, environmental resources, and forests, waters, etc., would be adequately incorporated, included as right holders into those solutions. That's the most important part, because we don't have time to negotiate. The issue that we have is that we have a very small window of time. If there's some issues of compliance with the time frame that is being done or given for those activities, therefore the main goal of preventing go beyond 1.5 degrees would not be recognized. And that in alignment with other measures that will be on top of industrial action in terms of limit of emissions, but also with the all politics of other private sector, non-private sector. All of them have to play a role. And what I don't see is that the people or significant sectors are given the recognition of their governance status. And we can argue in the way in which many peoples who are part of the normal daily lives here in the cities, how much action, how much influence they will have to play in parallel with action that companies or corporations should deploy. And that's something very debatable, but we must say that countries and the interests that manage huge amount of capital and huge impact should recognize the governments of, at least with priority, the peoples and the entities that have major impact right now, considering the urgency of the moment in order to prevent the non-compliance of major strategic goals are compromised in the next 8 years. That's the urgency.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Doug Becker. We're evaluating the COP26 meetings in Glasgow that took place earlier this month with Shannon Gibson of the University of Southern California, Klaus Weber of Northwestern University, and Reynaldo Morales of Northwestern University. And Klaus Weber, there's been a lot of conversation about the use of the concept of net reductions in carbon emissions. But the problem is, considering the nature of the threat to the planet, considering where we already are as far as increased temperatures, that we actually need absolute reductions rather than net reductions, real reductions. Stop getting credit for carbon offsets. So why are we still using net as the baseline for carbon reductions?
I think the notion of net reductions, which has become very prominent in both the political realm, but also in the private sector, is sort of it's a compromise, right? It allows us to say we want net reductions, which if the net actually works out and if the calculations work and the measures actually add up, is not a bad thing. The issue that people have with absolute reductions is twofold. One is that it oftentimes requires pretty dramatic sort of changes in industrial policy. So many countries are very heavily reliant on coal, for example. And so if you want absolute reductions, it means much more dramatic interventions in the economy and the power sector in particular. And that is very painful. So the net reductions is sort of the less painful solution. Whether it is a solution is really up for debate. There's good cause for skepticism. The other one is, if you look at absolute reductions, and if you should just take the example of coal, a coal-powered plant that I built today normally has a lifetime of several decades. And so we're building a lot of infrastructure now that, unless we basically throw it away way before its normal lifetime, which is very expensive and more disruptive, is going to lock us into a path that gets us well beyond 1.5%. And I think the 1.5% target, I think, is worth preserving. And there was a lot of debate around that at the summit. I think we need it as to keep us ambitious. But on the back of everyone's mind is that it really does not look like we're going to make it. Realistically, it's becoming far less possible, especially the shorter term measures that we need to take to get to 1.5, which really have to happen in the next 10, 15 years. And a lot of the commitments and promises, and even some of the net zero commitments, are in a different time frame. They're 2050, 2060, which sort of is a little too late to really get us to a sustainable path. And it creates this bulge of infrastructure that we build that is going to be very difficult to change. So I think the opposition to the real reductions comes from the recognition that we have built infrastructure, both in terms of electric grids, in terms of power infrastructure, transportation, agriculture, that is really very difficult to change in a 10, 15-year timeframe. And so the easy way out is to say, well, we're going to go net in the meantime, and gives us more time to make those larger transformations that are ultimately necessary. The problem, of course, with that path is that, and we've seen that with hindsight and historical experience, it also means that we're less likely to tackle those large transformations that we know are necessary, because we think we found a way to basically compensate for setting us on a trajectory that's going to build more infrastructure that doesn't allow us to reach climate change goals. And we compensate for it in the meantime, and it takes the pressure of making the real painful changes that we need to make. And so I think net targets are better than no targets, but they only really work if you have an overall goal and accounting. And I think that's one of the elements of the Glasgow agreement that is actually weaker. sort of linking all those individual commitments and making sure that they actually add up. And if you think of the offsetting, whether it actually adds up to the overall goal, that's not terribly well specified and well regulated. And I think that's the real danger, that we're basically fooling ourselves when we're saying, hey, we're on a path, but we have no way of actually verifying that everything adds up. And that's the real danger.
And Shannon Gibson, this is going to be our last question. Kind of the theme, both this and in our previous show, is, are these global actions up to the task of managing this threat of climate change? Klaus Weber suggested that the reason why net, is the preferred way of thinking of this in opposition to absolute reductions is that it's too painful to speak of absolute reductions because the economic pain potentially could be too great. But we know the threat that we're facing. Has COP been up to the challenge? And if not, what does COP27 need to do? Or should there be a COP27, or should we have a different approach?
There's a couple of ways to look at it, right? I think we started off the conversation with kind of acknowledging that the COP has become this international stage where states go to sort of perform their climate commitments and pledges, and their, make their commitments to sustainable development and things like that. And so the counter question is, well, what would they be doing in the shadows? Right. So the fact that we do have the COPs every year, at least every year, countries, even if it is performative to some extent, have to come on the international stage. Or if they don't, like China did, it'll be talked about a lot, to continually say that we care about climate change, we care about mitigation, adaptation, impacted communities, things like that. So, in terms of thinking of what are the impacts, I think we're going to keep having COPs. I don't know what will become after podcast, but I assure you, Doug, you and I will be having a conversation at COP55, right? In some format, talking about, was it enough? I think you can look at it in terms of absolute and relative change, right? So did COP26 do what we needed to do to avert catastrophic climate change and ease the impending suffering from, these expected weather changes and so on and so forth? No, absolutely it did not. But relatively, and I think a term that a lot of us have been using and talking about the COPs, it's just this exercise in incrementalism, right? So, we get these very tiny incremental changes. The COPs are a slow burn. Not too much happens that quick or that radically. But again, in the absence of this structure, I think, and process, I think we will be far worse off.
Sadly, I think you're correct, Shannon. Certainly from COP55, we're probably still going to be discussing both the contemporary and the likely future devastating effects of climate change. And some of the frustration in the COP process is, no matter what is reported as to the nature of climate change and the risks that we face, it's as though the political action, the social, the corporate action doesn't seem to grasp just how significant of a change that we need to make in order to address the crisis. Yes, Reynaldo, you'd like to respond?
When we discuss the political dimension, it certainly is a level of decision making. It's very important to recognize who are the most strategic actors in these meetings, where most of the people, the citizens, do not participate. There is an attempt to make their meaningful participation in different engagement groups and networks, but definitely when we evaluate or assess the COP, we cannot think about on how we all as a society move in certain directions, because these conventions or conferences do not represent the full legitimate aspiration of the whole society. Nation states and corporations lately, in some institutions, move completely under different interests. So what we're talking about is the reconciliation of these different actors.
And with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think it's a very important, I'll give you the last word, the need for greater representation, greater action of all people. Think of them not as just stakeholders, but that we are all needing to be empowered to be able to enact the changes necessary. I want to thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Our guests today have been Shannon Gibson, Associate Professor of Political Science, International Relations, and Environmental Studies at the University of Southern California. She's the author of Environmental Praxis, Climate Activism, and the UNFCCC, a Participatory Action Research Approach. Klaus Weber, Professor of Management and Organizations and the Deputy Director of the Buffett Institute Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. He's also affiliated with the Institute of Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern. He's the author of Organizational Structure from Interaction, Evidence from Corporate Sustainability Efforts. And Reynaldo Morales, assistant professor at Northwestern University, the joint faculty appointment at the Medill School of Journalism and Media and the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. He's the author of Building Global Indigenous Media Networks, Envisioning Sustainable and Regenerative Futures Around Indigenous Peoples' Meaningful Representation. I want to thank all three of you for a wonderful conversation.
And that's it for today's program. Thank you for listening. The Scholar Circle is hosted by Doug Becker. Its managing producers are Ankina Agassian and Melissa Chiprin. Sud Dongre is our webmaster and assistant producer. Our archives are at scholarcircle.org, and our podcasts are on Apple and Google Podcasts and iTunes. Please follow us on @ScholarCircle or me @Armudian and join our Facebook page. I'm the founder, anchor, and occasional host, Maria Armudian.